The wind that sweeps across the Syrian desert carries with it the dust of millennia, the eroded remnants of empires that have risen and fallen like the shifting dunes. If one were to stand on the rocky plains northeast of Homs in the dying days of the 13th century, specifically in the cold December of 1299, the wind would have carried something else. It would have carried the metallic tang of blood, the thunder of 40,000 hooves, and the desperate prayers of men facing their doom. This was the moment when the irresistible force of the Mongol Ilkhanate collided with the immovable object of the Mamluk Sultanate. It was a clash that would briefly and miraculously reignite a flicker of hope in the hearts of a defeated Christendom, a moment when it seemed that the horsemen of the steppes had arrived not as destroyers, but as saviors. To understand the magnitude of the Battle of Wadi al Khaznadar, we must first strip away the romanticized veneer of history and look at the brutal geopolitical reality of the Middle East in 1299. The Crusades, for all intents and purposes, were over. The great Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, which had stood for nearly 2 centuries, had been swept into the sea. 8 years prior, in 1291, the city of Acre had fallen in a storm of fire and steel, marking the end of the Crusader presence on the Levantine mainland. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller had retreated to the island of Cyprus, looking back at the coast of the Holy Land with a mixture of grief and impotence. The Mamluks of Egypt, a caste of elite slave soldiers who had usurped power from their Ayyubid masters, now held the entirety of Syria and Palestine in an iron grip. They were the undisputed masters of the Islamic world, the guardians of Mecca and Medina, and the only military force that had successfully halted the Mongol juggernaut at the Battle of Ain Jalut 40 years earlier. But the Mongol threat had not vanished, it had merely evolved. To the east, in Persia, the Ilkhanate, a fragment of Genghis Khan's fractured empire, had consolidated its power. The Ilkhans were no longer the shamanistic raiders of the past. They were settling, building cities, and engaging in complex diplomacy. Sitting on the Ilkhanid throne was Ghazan Khan, a figure of immense complexity. Though he had converted to Islam, taking the name Mahmud, his political interests placed him in direct opposition to his fellow Muslims in Egypt. The Mamluks were his rivals for control of the fertile lands of Syria and the lucrative trade routes that terminated at the Mediterranean. For Ghazan, religion was secondary to the imperial imperative of the Mongol state, expansion and domination. For the shattered remnants of the Crusader states, and for the monarchs of Europe, the Mongols represented a desperate plan B. For decades, popes and kings had exchanged letters with the Mongol Khans, dreaming of a grand Franco-Mongol alliance. The idea was simple. The Christians would attack from the sea, the Mongols would attack from the east, and the Mamluk Sultanate would be crushed between them like grain in a millstone. It was a dream fueled by the legend of Prester John, a mythical Christian king in the east who would come to the aid of the faithful. By 1299, with the Holy Land lost, this dream was all that remained. The spark for the campaign of 1299 was a Mamluk preemptive strike. The Sultan in Cairo, knowing that the Ilkhanate was distracted by internal rebellions and wars on its northern border, had supported rebels against Ghazan. This was a miscalculation. Ghazan Khan was a man of fierce intellect and terrifying resolve. He stabilized his borders, gathered a massive army, and turned his gaze west. His army was a diverse coalition. At its core were the Mongol Tumans, the heavy cavalry and horse archers that had terrified the world. But riding alongside them were thousands of Christian soldiers, Armenians from the Kingdom of Cilicia, and Georgians from the Caucasus. For these Christian vassals, this was a holy war as much as a territorial dispute. They rode to reclaim their lands and to strike back at the Mamluks who had ravaged their borders for decades. As the Mongol army, numbering perhaps 60,000 men, crossed the Euphrates and began the march toward Syria, panic began to spread in Damascus and Cairo. The Mamluk Sultan, al-Nasir Muhammad, who was still a young man and under the influence of his powerful emirs, scrambled to assemble the army of Egypt. The Mamluks were professional soldiers par excellence. Trained from boyhood in the arts of war, they were heavily armored, disciplined, and masters of the lance and sword. They had defeated the Mongols before, and they were confident they could do it again. The Mamluk army marched north from Egypt, gathering garrisons from Gaza and Jerusalem as they went, aiming to intercept Ghazan before he could ravage the heartland of Syria. The two forces converged near the city of Homs, at a place known as Wadi al Khaznadar, the Valley of the Treasurer. It was late December. The weather was uncharacteristically cold, even for the Syrian winter. Rain turned the dust into slick mud, and a biting wind cut through mail and fur alike. This is a crucial detail often overlooked. The Mongol bow, a composite, masterpiece of horn, wood, and sinew, relied on tension that could be affected by humidity. The Mamluks hoped the weather would nullify the Mongol advantage in range. On the morning of the battle, the Mamluk army, numbering roughly 20 to 30,000, took up a defensive position. They were outnumbered, perhaps 2 to 1, but they held the high ground and were anchored by the terrain. The Mamluk heavy cavalry, the Royal Mamluks, were clad in lamellar armor and chainmail, their horses barded in steel and felt. They looked like statues of iron against the gray sky. Across the valley, the Mongol host arrayed itself in a vast crescent, the traditional formation designed to envelop an enemy. The battle began not with a chaotic melee, but with a calculated probe. The Mamluk right wing, composed of Bedouin auxiliaries and light cavalry, charged the Mongol left. To the shock of the Mongol commanders, the Mamluk charge was ferocious. The Mongol left wing crumbled. It seemed for a brief, terrifying hour that history was repeating itself. The ghosts of Angelut hovered over the battlefield. The Mamluk commanders, seeing the Mongol flank collapse, believed victory was imminent. They pressed the advantage, their heavy cavalry smashing into the Mongol lines, their lances shattering shields and skewering men. But Ghazan Khan was not a commander to panic. From his position in the center, he observed the collapse of his left flank with a cold detachment. He realized that the Mamluk aggression had left their own center exposed. In a move that demonstrated the tactical flexibility that made the Mongols the masters of war, Ghazan ordered his center to dismount. This was highly unusual for a Mongol army, which lived and died in the saddle. By dismounting, the Mongol heavy infantry and archers formed a solid wall of shields and spears, using their horses as living barricades. As the Mamluk center charged, expecting to sweep away the horsemen, they instead crashed into a disciplined shield wall. The momentum of the Mamluk charge was absorbed, and then the trap was sprung. Ghazan ordered his archers to loose their arrows. Despite the damp weather, the sheer volume of fire was devastating. At close range, the heavy Mongol arrows punched through Mamluk armor. The horses of the Mamluks, vulnerable targets, were brought down in droves. The charge stalled in a mire of mud and blood. Simultaneously, Ghazan unleashed his right wing. These fresh Tumans swung wide, bypassing the engagement in the center and wheeling around to strike the Mamluk left flank. The Mamluk army, which had extended itself to chase the retreating Mongol left, was now caught in a vice. The discipline of the Egyptian army began to fracture. The young sultan, watching from the rear, saw his elite guards being ground down by the relentless pressure of the Mongol advance. The turning point came in the late afternoon. The Mamluks, realizing they were being encircled, began to give ground. Tactical withdrawal is the hardest maneuver in warfare, and under the pressure of Mongol arrows, it quickly turned into a rout. The cohesion of the Mamluk units disintegrated. Men turned their horses south toward Damascus, fleeing for their lives. The Mongols, remounting their fresh horses, gave chase. The pursuit was merciless. For miles, the road to Homs was littered with the bodies of the Mamluk elite. It was a total, crushing victory for Ghazan Khan. The news of the Battle of Wadi al Khaznadar hit the region like a thunderclap. The invincible Mamluks had been broken. The Sultan had fled back to Cairo in disgrace. Syria lay open. The Mongol army marched triumphantly into Damascus. The city, abandoned by its military governor, surrendered. This is where the narrative takes on a near-mythical quality for the Christians of the time. For the Christian populations of the Levant, the Maronites, the Jacobites, and the remnants of the Latin populace, the arrival of Ghazan was seen as divine intervention. The Mongols, unlike the Mamluks who had persecuted them, were generally tolerant of other faiths, and their army contained thousands of their co-religionists. The Armenian king Hethum II, who had fought alongside Ghazan, entered Damascus in triumph. Rumors began to fly across the Mediterranean, growing more fantastic with every mile they traveled. By the time the news reached Cyprus, and then Rome and Paris, the story had mutated. The reports claimed that the Mongols had not just taken Damascus, but that they had liberated Jerusalem itself. It was whispered that Ghazan had converted to Christianity, that the Holy Sepulchre was once again in friendly hands, and that the Mongols were waiting for the armies of Europe to join them. For a brief, shining moment in the spring of 1300, Europe believed the Crusades had been won by proxy. Pope Boniface VIII received letters celebrating the recovery of the Holy Land. The Jubilee year of 1300 was celebrated in Rome with a fervor heightened by these rumors. The psychological impact was immense. After decades of defeat and depression, the Christian world felt the tide had finally turned. In reality, the situation was far more nuanced. Ghazan had indeed conquered Syria, and his forces did raid as far south as Gaza and Jerusalem. There are accounts of Mongol patrols entering the Holy City, and certainly the Mamluk garrison had fled. But the Mongols did not occupy Jerusalem in force. Their focus was on logistics and grazing for their massive herds of horses. Jerusalem, in the Judean hills, offered little in the way of fodder. However, the saving of the Crusaders was not entirely a myth. For the Armenians of Cilicia, the victory at Wadi al Khaznadar was a lifeline. It bought them a reprieve from Mamluk aggression that would last for several years. It allowed them to recover territory and rebuild their shattered defenses. For the Knights on Cyprus, it provided a strategic window. They launched raids on the Syria and coast, attempting to coordinate with the Mongols, establishing a bridgehead on the island of Arwad, just off the coast of Tartus. They waited there, looking east, expecting the Mongol return that would finally allow them to retake the mainland. But the tragedy of this moment lies in its brevity. The Mongol way of war was seasonal. As the spring of 1300 approached, the grazing lands of Syria began to dry up. The vast herds of horses required to sustain the Mongol army could not be fed. Furthermore, a new threat had emerged on Ghazan's eastern border. The Chagatai Khanate was invading the Ilkhanate. Faced with a two-front war and logistical challenges, Ghazan made the decision to withdraw the bulk of his army back to Persia, leaving only a small holding force in Syria. The vacuum left by the Mongol withdrawal was filled almost immediately by the resurgent Mamluks. They had been beaten but not destroyed. The Mamluk state was a machine built for war, and its capacity for regeneration was terrifying. Within months, they had reorganized. They marched back into Syria, sweeping aside the small Mongol garrisons. The Christians of Damascus, who had celebrated the Mongol victory, now faced the wrath of the returning Mamluks. The brief flicker of hope was extinguished. The Knights on the island of Arwad held out for 2 more years, waiting for a Mongol return that never truly materialized in force. When the Mamluks finally besieged and captured Arwad in 1302, it marked the final, definitive end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The last foothold was gone. Yet, the Battle of Wadi al Khaznadar remains a fascinating historical pivot point. It challenges the monolithic narrative of Islam versus Christianity that often dominates the history of the Crusades. Here we had a Muslim Mongol Khan, fighting alongside Christian Armenian kings, destroying a Muslim Mamluk army, and being celebrated by the Pope. It was a moment where the lines of allegiance were drawn not by faith, but by realpolitik. The battle also serves as a testament to the military genius of the Mongols. Even a century after Genghis Khan, they were capable of adapting, evolving, and defeating the most advanced military powers of the age. The tactic of dismounting heavy cavalry to absorb a charge, only to unleash a flanking maneuver, was a masterstroke that studied military academies for centuries. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the battle is the what if. What if Ghazan had not been forced to withdraw? What if the logistical constraints of the Syrian desert had not forced the Mongols back to the Euphrates? Could a stable Mongol-Christian alliance have held Jerusalem? It is unlikely. The cultural and political distances between the courts of Europe and the yurts of the Ilkhanate were too vast. The Crusaders wanted a subservient ally, the Mongols demanded submission. It was a relationship doomed by mutual misunderstanding. However, for those few months in the winter of 1299 and the spring of 1300, the impossible seemed possible. The victory at Wadi al Khaznadar stands as a testament to the fluidity of history. It reminds us that the end of an era is rarely a clean break. There are aftershocks, echoes, and moments where the past tries to reassert itself. The Mongols did not save the Crusaders in the long run. History had already turned the page on the Latin East. but they did provide a dramatic, bloody epilogue to 2 centuries of conflict. They proved that the Mamluks were not invincible. They gave the weary warriors of Christendom one last glimpse of the hills of Jerusalem, not through their own conquest, but through the strange, thundering intervention of the horsemen from the east. In the end, the wind reclaimed the battlefield. The bones of the Mamluk dead were buried by the shifting sands. The Mongol Tumans retreated into the mists of Persia. The Mamluks rebuilt their citadels, stronger than before, but the memory of that winter, when the world turned upside down, lingered. It remained